All right. So far in this class, we've talked about quite a bit of history. We've gone over several thousand years of our thinking about how minds work. We've done a little bit of theoretical background in philosophy of science, computer science, information theory, and math. We've explored the idea of a representational theory of mind, also specifically through computational theory of mind. Representation again is just something standing for something, whether your mind can um, pay specific attention to something out in the world, whether it can be aware of it in some sense. And the metaphor that we were using in the classical approach was a computer metaphor. So we explored that and some objections to that, some mental architectures of how our minds are organized in general, uh, and some problems with that. And then we also just did quite a bit of cognitive science. So I've moved this around a little bit. This isn't exactly how I presented it, but it is showing you some conceptual threads rather than the roughly chronological approach I took at first, and then when we started switching to a more conceptual approach. So today we're starting a new section. I'm recording these out of order, so try to upload them in the correct order, but the new section is going to be cognition. And we're going to start off with consciousness. As background, the discussion of ancients and with people in modernity said, and even in the 1800s, how they explored consciousness, that's going to be helpful to keep in the back of your mind. We're going to ask this question about what consciousness is, and then explore some easy problems, and then something that's been called the hard problem. So what the heck is consciousness? You can actually, we can start off by going to the dictionary, which is really trite, and I don't want to see any paper starting this way. But roughly it means being aware of something, being privy to knowing yourself, having some access to your agency, right? And knowing your judgments, your feelings, that kind of thing. We all have an idea of what it is. And I think when we start getting into these details, it can be easy to get lost. But know that you have an idea of what consciousness is, and most attempts to try to give it very rigorous definitions will fail, and they'll just be gestures. It'll be like that thing that you know, right? So do you perceive your thoughts? Do you know your thoughts? Is there something else going on? You perceive the external world? Do you know about the external world? Or is it fitting into a global state? Yourself, your inner life, your internal sensations, right? Like these are all, there's perception views of consciousness and knowledge views of consciousness, and then this extra other view, global state view. But all of these are just gesturing at this thing that you know, right? You know what it is that you know when you're not conscious, and you know when you are. And when you think back to like very early in your life, there might have been some consciousness there, but it feels like a different consciousness than the consciousness you have now. So it's going to be one of those terms that we kind of know it when we see it, and it might be a problem, right? But it's not a problem that's of particularly special to the mind, right? If you really want to mess with a biologist, ask them what life is, right? Like a suitable set of questions will eventually get them to throw their hands up in the air. Same with energy for physics. Same with all of the grounding concepts for most other fields. This is just how it is. We have an idea of what it is, but every time we try to rigorously define it, we capture part of it. So maybe it's not one thing, maybe it's many things. No, we'll explore those options later. Some people think that consciousness really is just metacognition, that is awareness of awareness. So it's not a kind of perception or a kind of knowledge. Really, it's an awareness of an awareness, a perception of a perception, a knowledge of a knowledge, just some sort of, just a higher order thing. And so in that case, you can imagine having higher order and higher order. You can imagine getting a very trite sense of higher order cognition for a computer. So artificial intelligence would, quote, be conscious under this view very easily. So one of the problems here, the philosopher's problem, rather than the problem that I just said, where computers could be conscious quite easily, is that one of the defining features of representations, as we talked about, right? So if a global state, if a higher order state of your consciousness is anything, it's a representation of yourself, right, of your own thoughts. So then the question is, how the hell does that work? How could you possibly be wrong about your own mental states? And to see why that matters, realize that the thing that makes something a representation is that it could be wrong. At least that's one of the key features. It's specific, it's accurate, blah, blah, blah. But it could be wrong. If you misrepresent the world, that's a hallucination or a dream or something. Now, if the higher order theories are correct, it seems possible that you could be wrong about your own consciousness, your own being in excruciating pain, for example. But that seems problematic. Some people bite the bullet and say, no, you can be wrong. Okay, that's a possibility. It just seems problematic to some people. So maybe something else is in order. Another bit of data to throw in here is this notion that there might actually be a continuum of conscious states. And so when we're attempting to define what consciousness is, we're actually probably defining across some of these many states. All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the easy problems. I might even get to the hard problem of consciousness. But we're going to distinguish between what are called so-called easy problems, which are actually pretty hard, right? Like the fact that they're called easy problems doesn't mean that they're solvable. It just means that we know how to solve them. And then we'll get to the hard problem, which we don't even know how to get started solving. So some of the easy problems are things like, what are we aware of? How does awareness work? How do we get to be aware of certain things? What is the relationship between attention and consciousness? How does it, is consciousness related to actions? Is it unitary? Is it knowledge or perception, or this higher order theory I was talking about? Right, so those are, quote, easy problems. The hard problem is, how can this lump of meat between my ears perceive the color red? What is consciousness? How can we connect these, this feeling and the subjective experience that we all have, and what science can study, which is maybe not completely objective, but it's certainly not subjective, or at least not fully subjective. It might be intersubjective. Okay, so in this section, we talked about what consciousness was, and we said, well, we kind of know it when we see it. There's some views that it might be a perception, it might be some knowledge, it might be just awareness of awareness, a perception of a perception, knowledge of knowledge. That had problems, but some people are okay with those problems. And then we distinguish between different states of consciousness and the easy problem and the hard problem. Let's get to some of those easy problems. So William James defines attention as the conscious experience of all and only the stimuli we attend to. So consciousness is attention in some deep sense. We isolate conscious experience and boost apparent stimulus contrasts. So when you go to a cocktail party, it's really loud, there's lots of stuff going on. You don't notice anything until somebody says your name, and then you hone in on that. You become conscious of it. You attend to it, and you become aware of it, and you come to consciousness of it. So that raises a couple of questions, right? When does attention matter in conscious perception? At what point, and how does it affect it? And we can investigate this, right? Like, this isn't the kind of thing that's beyond the reach of science. There's people that are actively have spent time on this. We can measure how many people are in a cocktail party, how loud the decibel is, how much attention involved. Like, we can control some of these variables. I like putting people's names up here and seeing just how quickly you hone in on your own name, for example. You become aware, these are just names, these are just names, until you see your name and you're like, oh, whoa, what's going on here? If we were all just chatting randomly, and I do this when we do in-person classes, just say, oh, let's all just talk, blah, 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 and then every once in a while, pick a name and say it, and see if you hear your name and it draws your attention. So the cacophony, it's easy to cut through it when you hear your name. We've all experienced this. Attention and awareness have a relationship, perhaps a direct relationship to consciousness. So that's one easy problem. Here's another easy problem. It seems that there are some people, and there are some cases and situations where we have information without consciousness. There's a really cool phenomenon. It's probably not cool to live with, but there's a phenomenon that's fascinating called blind sight. And what blind sight is a blind person who has some damage to their brain, to their the path of their optic nerves, or something having to do with their visual field. They have some particular damage, so that they do not report being aware. They don't see anything, and yet they do above chance when you put them in an obstacle course, or when you ask them to guess how many things are in front of them. So they somehow, their brain is processing something that their mind is not aware of. They report being fully blind, and yet they behave in ways that imply that they can actually see something. Some of these links, I'll upload the PowerPoint. You can go to some of these. So blind sight is one phenomenon that's fascinating. You can have information without being conscious, which is cool. It's weird and interesting. So it doesn't mean that, in fact, you're not fully aware of every bit of information you have, which of course you're not, but it's interesting that we have specific examples of that. There's also illusions of attention. So a lot of these links are going to be to optical illusions of various sorts. The inattentional blindness, there will be things that will change around you that you will not notice because you're not paying attention. You're going to ignore things that are in front of you. Things that will change, things that will blink. There's even going to be just a gradual change in front of your own eyes. You can go to all of these videos, trust me, they're worth viewing and sharing with your friends. Each of these videos will show you that the things that you think you are aware of, you might not actually be aware of. There's also these phenomena where we know that there is missing information, and yet we add that information in there. So pick one of the white dots or white squares and stare at it. in one of the figures, the blue circle, in fact, in all of these figures, the blue circle, one of the blue circles will disappear. Your mind will fill it in. You just keep staring at it. Pause the video and then do this. Or just trust me. It's strange that your mind like fills in these gaps. It like, you know what the image is, and yet you fill in the experience of it. So look at the square, stare at the square. I'm not going to keep staring at it. Just pause the video and keep staring at it until you don't see that blue circle. Do that again with this one. You'll fill in the donut holes. Do that again with each of these squares. And this one. All right. So there's another problem, and there's one of these readings talks about it, whether there is a single thing called consciousness. Now, when you try to actually look at the evidence of this, it's kind of weird. The modernists didn't feel the need to argue for this. They felt like it'd be weird if there were two minds in your body. Yeah, it would be weird. And yet, when we try to find evidence, we find these cases where we've already talked about visual agnosias, but there's a variety of cases where people report being aware of certain things or not being aware of certain things, and they nevertheless act in disagreement with that, right? So I'm sure you've heard of mirror twins, agnosinosias. God, it's not knowing that you don't know, like people that think that they're not blind but actually are, the opposite of blind sight. That one's crazy. They will get in the car and drive even though they're actually blind, right? Like they will walk around and run into things and claim that they hemi-neglect, we talked about in the previous video. Schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder may have come up in abnormal psychology classes. These are various disorders in which you hear things or see things or perceive things, at least in certain kinds of schizophrenia, and others it's just word salads, but you perceive things that aren't there. Dissociative identity, you perceive yourself as having multiple personalities. Split brain, I wish we could spend more time on that. Split brain cases are insane. These are people who their corpus callosum that connects the left and right hemisphere has been severed. And so what they end up doing is they can process as if they have two minds. They can draw things with both hands simultaneously and separately. If you show one thing to one side and ask them to draw it, so one visual field, just click the link. It's well worth it. All of these examples are insane, and we'll talk about them in class. So the split brain cases, you have a person who you will flash an image to them, to let's say the right visual hemisphere, and then a different image to their left visual part of the visual field, and the images will be different, and they will act according to one but report according to the other. So if you flash stand up on one side and Coca-Cola on the other, and then they stand up and you ask them why they stood up, they'll say they want to get a Coke. So, all right, that's weird. They report not being conscious of what's going on. So maybe the conscious mind is in the left hemisphere. Or maybe the right hemisphere is thinking, but it's not integrated into the mind. Or there are two conscious minds. or there's a dissociated mind, or there is one mind, but it becomes dissociated in very weird conditions, right? So the troubling thing about the split brain cases is that these people act like normal. They report their actions like normal, and yet we know what caused their actions. So they behave in ways where they confabulate. They make up stories after the fact of why they acted. And the worry is that this is what we do all the time. All right. That's going to lead us to this other easy problem, which is perhaps not that easy, of is consciousness a grand illusion? We'll do that in the next lesson. For now, we're going to just pause here and save the next video for the hard problem of consciousness.